February 14, 1943, Sidi Bouzid, central Tunisia, Fani. The morning air over the Fayed Pass was deceptively calm, a stillness that masked the mechanical leviathan coiling in the shadows of the Atlas Mountains. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of the U.S. II Corps, sat in an underground bunker nearly 80 miles behind the front lines, a distance so great that his orders arrived at the front outdated by the time radio operators decoded them. The Americans had arrived in North Africa 3 months earlier during Operation Torch, storming the beaches of Morocco and Algeria with the swagger of a nation that had never known a modern military defeat. They brought with them the might of Detroit and Pittsburgh, an endless logistical train of Coca-Cola, chocolate, and Lucky Strike cigarettes, convinced that the sheer weight of American industry would crush the German war machine like a bug beneath a boot. But war is not merely a question of tonnage. It is a question of psychology, ballistics, and the brutal geometry of the battlefield, lessons the Wehrmacht had spent 3 bloody years perfecting, while the American army was still practicing with wooden guns and trucks labeled tank. The men of the U.S. 1st Armored Division, standing watch in the valley below, looked impressive on paper. They were well fed, their uniforms were crisp, and their M4 Shermans and M3 Grant tanks gleamed with factory-new paint. Yet beneath the veneer of industrial superiority lay a rot of dangerous naivety. They were, in the parlance of the veterans, green. They approached the Desert War as if it were a high-speed maneuver exercise in Louisiana, blissfully unaware that they were being watched by the most battle-hardened predators in military history. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was sick, tired, and running low on fuel, but his Africa Corps possessed a lethality that American commanders could not comprehend. From the high ridges, German optics, crafted by Zeiss with a clarity American lenses could not match, observed the American positions with predatory patience. What the Germans saw was an insult to tactical doctrine. The Americans had positioned their forces on the low ground, isolated on hills like islands in a sea of sand, too far apart to support one another, exposing their flanks in a display of amateurism that would have resulted in a court-martial in the German army. The American commanders believed their technology was superior, a fatal miscalculation born of isolation. They placed their faith in the M3 Grant tank, a clumsy, high-profile vehicle with a rivet-studded hull that the British had already grimly nicknamed the Grave for 7 Brothers. Its 75mm gun was mounted in the side sponson, forcing the tank to expose its entire hull just to fire, a design flaw that German gunners, accustomed to hull-down tactics, found almost laughable. Across the valley, hidden beneath camouflage netting and layers of dust, waited the Panzer VI Tiger. 56 tons of hardened Krupp steel, armed with the terrifying 88mm KWK 36 gun. The Tiger was not just a tank. It was a mathematical impossibility to the American mind. Its frontal armor was 100mm thick, impervious to nearly every weapon in the American arsenal at combat ranges. The Americans had been told by their intelligence that German morale was breaking, that the Africa Corps was a hollow shell. This was the lie that would cost 3,000 men their lives or freedom in a single week. At 06:30 hours, the illusion of American invincibility evaporated in a storm of high-velocity steel. Operation Frühlingswind, or Spring Breeze, began not with a whisper, but with the thunder of the 10th and 21st Panzer Division surging forward. The sound of the German 80mm flak gun, repurposed for anti-tank warfare, became the defining psychological scar of the campaign. The 88 fired a shell traveling at supersonic speeds. The American tankers heard the crack of the impact before they heard the boom of the gun. It was a weapon of terrifying precision, capable of turning an American tank into a burning coffin from 2 kilometers away. Long before the American gunners could even see a target, the slaughter at Sidi Bouzid was absolute. American tanks, maneuvering blindly into the kill zones Rommel had designed, were picked off with contemptuous ease, The radios of the 1st Armored Division screamed with panic and confusion as commanders realized their shells were bouncing harmlessly off the German panzers, while their own armor shattered like glass. The physics of the engagement were merciless. A Tiger tank could destroy a Sherman from 2,000 meters. A Sherman had to close to within 500 meters and strike from the side to have a prayer of penetrating a Tiger. The Americans were trying to fight a knife fight against a sniper. But the failure was not just technological. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership. General Fredendall, obsessed with maps and engineering projects far from the fighting, had ordered his engineers to blast entrenched positions into the rock, fixing his troops in static defensive lines, a strategy that had died in 1918. He ignored the frantic intelligence reports from his forward observers, dismissing the German movement as a feint. This arrogance trickled down to the individual soldier. Many GIs, having never seen combat, froze when the shelling started. They had been trained to fight by the book, but the Germans were rewriting the book in real time. The Luftwaffe, flying the Bf-109 and the terrifying Stuka dive bombers, ruled the skies over the Kasserine Pass, strafing retreating columns that had become snarled in a traffic jam of panic. Trucks laden with supplies, thousands of gallons of gasoline, crates of ammunition, medical supplies, were abandoned by fleeing troops, falling into German hands and refueling the very tanks that were hunting them. It was a logistical suicide. Rommel, observing the collapse of the American lines, wrote to his wife that the Americans had tremendous material wealth but no instinct for war. He saw them not as soldiers but as tourists in uniform, armed with weapons they did not understand, led by men who treated war like a corporation rather than a blood sport. By February 19th, as the Africa Corps pushed through the Kasserine Pass, the humiliation of the United States Army was complete. The pass itself, a 2-mile-wide gap in the dorsal Atlas Mountains, became a graveyard of American ambition. The 30,000 Americans engaged in the battle suffered over 6,000 casualties, with thousands taken prisoner, marching past the burning wrecks of their own vehicles. The Germans, outnumbered and running on fumes, had inflicted a defeat that shook the Allied command to its core. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, watching the disaster unfold from Algiers, realized that the American army was soft, undisciplined, and tactically illiterate. The Green Army had paid the tuition of war in blood. The myth that American boys raised on baseball and hunting were natural warriors was shattered by the precision of German gunnery. They learned amidst the burning cactus and the freezing desert nights that bravery without competence is just suicide. The shock of Kasserine was necessary. It stripped away the vanity of the American command. It proved that industrial production alone could not win battles if the men operating the machines were led by fools. The burning hulks of 183 American tanks littering the Tunisian desert stood as a monument to the dangerous idea that war would be easy. The Green Army had walked into the desert expecting a parade. They found instead a slaughterhouse, and the survivors who crawled out of the Kasserine Pass were no longer green. They were terrified. They were angry. And for the first time, they understood the true cost of the crusade they had undertaken. This was the rude awakening. The realization that the road to Berlin would not be paved with good intentions and superior logistics, but would have to be carved inch by bloody inch against an enemy who knew how to kill with a proficiency the Americans were only just beginning to comprehend. The holiday was over. The real war had just begun. February 19, 1943. The Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The rain that lashed against the slit trenches of the American defenders was cold. A miserable, driving sleet that turned the reddish dust of the Atlas Mountains into a thick, clinging paste that jammed rifles and bogged down half-tracks. To the soldiers of the U.S. II Corps, huddled in their foxholes and watching the gray mist swirl through the 2-mile gap in the Grand Dorsal Chain, the war felt less like a crusade for democracy and more like a chaotic, localized apocalypse. They were about to experience the single most humiliating event in American military history, a disaster so complete that it would force the entire United States Army to question its doctrine, its leadership, and its very ability to fight a modern war. The collapse did not begin with a single gunshot. It began with a paralysis of command that started at the top and rotted its way down to the riflemen. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, still ensconced in his fortified tunnel complex 80 miles away in Tebessa, was effectively fighting a different battle than the one unfolding on the ground. He had split his forces into isolated pockets, penny packets, as the British derisively called them, scattering battalions across high ground where they could not support one another, leaving the valley floor, the very avenue of approach for German armor, dangerously exposed. It was a tactical disposition that violated every principle of armored warfare, a static defense against an enemy defined by mobility. Facing them was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, sensing one final opportunity to break the Allied line and capture the immense supply depots at Tebessa. Rommel, observing the American dispositions, did not see a formidable defensive line. He saw a door left unlocked by an amateur. At 15:30 hours, the assault began. It was not the mindless charge the Americans had seen in propaganda films, but a surgical dissection of their defenses. The veteran infantry of the Africa Corps, hardened by years of desert warfare, infiltrated the high ground first, moving through the mist like ghosts to neutralize the American observation posts. Then came the armor. The 10th Panzer Division and the 21st Panzer Division surged into the pass, their movements coordinated by radio with a precision the Americans could not match. The American defense, anchored by Stark Force under Colonel Alexander Stark, began to unravel within minutes. The American tanks, positioned too far back to effectively engage the German spearhead, were forced to rush forward piecemeal, driving straight into kill zones where German 80mm anti-tank guns and Tiger tanks were waiting. The result was a massacre of machinery. The psychological impact of the German assault was devastating. American troops, many seeing combat for the first time, found that their training had not prepared them for the sheer auditory violence of the battlefield. The screech of the Nebelwerfer multi-barreled rocket launchers, which the GIs terrifiedly nicknamed "screaming Mimis," shattered the nerve of men who had never heard a shot fired in anger. As the German tanks broke through the thin defensive screen, a contagion of panic, later termed Kasserine Pass, began to spread through the ranks. It wasn't just a retreat, it was a disintegration. Officers lost contact with their platoons, radio networks jammed by German electronic warfare or simply overwhelmed by incoherent shouting ceased to function as tools of command. The roads leading back to the Algerian border became clogged with a chaotic stream of fleeing vehicles, jeeps, cargo trucks, and ambulances, mixed with demoralized infantrymen who had thrown away their rifles to run faster. They were fleeing not just the Germans, but the sudden crushing realization that their equipment was inferior and their leaders were incompetent. The M3 Grant tanks burned just as easily as they had at Sidi Bouzid, their high silhouettes making perfect targets in the narrow confines of the pass. The 37mm anti-tank guns, the standard infantry anti-armor weapon, bounced shells off the frontal armor of the panzers as if they were firing spitballs, leaving gun crews to be crushed beneath the treads of the advancing behemoths. By the evening of February 20th, the Germans had punched through the pass and were fanning out, threatening to encircle the entire British First Army to the north. But the true scale of the humiliation was found in what the Americans left behind. The retreat was so precipitous that the U.S. Army effectively donated a massive arsenal to the Wehrmacht. Rommel's troops, driving past burning American depots, were astonished by the sheer volume of material abandoned by the fleeing Yankees. They found entire motor pools of serviceable trucks, thousands of gallons of precious gasoline, crates of chocolate, cartons of cigarettes, and stockpiles of new boots and uniforms. For the resource-starved Germans who were scavenging fuel from wrecked vehicles to keep their tanks running, this was a bonanza. It reinforced their stereotype of the American soldier, a man who had everything but knew how to fight with nothing. German officers noted in their diaries that the Americans seemed to treat war as a logistical exercise rather than a contest of will. When the logistics failed, the will evaporated. One German report sent back to Berlin noted with contempt that the American prisoners they captured seemed bewildered, more interested in when they would be fed than in escaping or resisting. The tactical failure was compounded by a strategic blindness. American air power, which should have pummeled the German columns bottlenecked in the pass, was grounded by bad weather and poor coordination between air and ground commanders. The Luftwaffe, however, managed to fly sorties that kept the retreating Americans pinned down, the screaming dive of the Stukas adding to the terror on the clogged roads. As the route continued toward the town of Thala, the systemic nature of the collapse became undeniable. It wasn't that the individual American soldier was cowardly. There were countless acts of desperate bravery, of lone machine gunners holding positions until they were overrun, but the system in which they fought was broken. The flow of information from the front to the rear took hours, while the German decision loop took minutes. American artillery, theoretically the best in the world, was often silent because forward observers were dead or had no radio link to the batteries. The Green Army was fighting a 1918 battle with 1943 weapons, and they were paying for the discrepancy in blood. General Eisenhower, monitoring the disintegration from his headquarters, was appalled. He had expected inexperienced troops to be rough around the edges, but he had not expected a total collapse of discipline. Reports reached him of officers removing their rank insignia to avoid being identified by snipers, of units abandoning their wounded to save themselves. It was a low point for the U.S. Army, a moment where the entire Allied strategy in North Africa seemed on the verge of being thrown into the sea. The British commanders, who had long harbored doubts about the fighting quality of their American cousins, were scathing. General Harold Alexander, commander of the 18th Army Group, remarked that the Americans were soft, green, and quite untrained. The humiliation was total. The United States, the arsenal of democracy, the industrial giant that was supposed to save the free world, had been slapped across the face by a smaller, exhausted, but infinitely more professional force. The defeat at Kasserine Pass was not just a lost battle. It was a revelation of a fundamental truth. The American Army was a hollow construct, built on the false assumption that mass production could substitute for military proficiency. They had approached the Wehrmacht with the arrogance of a rich man entering a street fight, assuming his wallet would protect him, only to be beaten bloody by a starving professional. As the smoke cleared over the pass and the Germans finally halted their advance, running out of fuel and overextended, the survivors of the Second Corps sat in the mud of Tebessa, shivering and shocked. They had lost 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, 208 guns, and over 6,000 men. But in the ashes of that defeat, the delusion was finally burned away. The Green Army was dead, buried in the wreckage of Kasserine. The force that would rise from its grave would have to be forged in fire, stripped of its arrogance, and rebuilt from the ground up. The holiday was over. The era of the amateur was finished. The Americans now knew that to beat the Germans they would have to become harder, faster, and more ruthless than the enemy they faced. And for that, they would need a new kind of leader. A man who didn't care about feelings or defensive lines, but only about the brutal mathematics of killing. The stage was set for the arrival of the warrior who would turn this broken army into a weapon of conquest. March 4th, 1943. Tebessa, Algeria. The mud that clung to the boots of General Dwight D. Eisenhower was thick and heavy, a physical manifestation of the morass into which his American Second Corps had sunk. As the Supreme Allied commander toured the rear areas of the battered corps, the stench of defeat was stronger than the smell of cordite. It wasn't just the broken equipment or the rows of wounded men waiting for transport. It was the atmosphere. Eisenhower, a man known for his diplomatic veneer and affable grin, felt his smile vanish, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. What he saw was not an army regrouping for a counterattack, but a mob that had forgotten it was a military force. He saw soldiers wandering without helmets, their uniforms unbuttoned, cigarettes dangling from their lips in the presence of senior officers. He saw sentries sitting down on duty, rifles propped against trees, seemingly indifferent to the fact that the most dangerous army in the world was only a few dozen miles to the east. There were no salutes, no snap of discipline, only the sullen, hollow stares of men who had been beaten and expected to be beaten again. This was not the professional force that the War Department had promised him. It was a constabulary of amateurs who had mistaken a war zone for a camping trip. The rot, Eisenhower realized, was not in the metal of the tanks or the caliber of the guns, but in the spine of the command. The epicenter of this systemic failure was located in a ravine near Tebessa, a place the troops had ironically nicknamed Speedy Valley. Here, miles from the front, Major General Lloyd Fredendall had constructed a monument to his own paranoia. While his men were being slaughtered in shallow foxholes at Kasserine, Fredendall had diverted an entire engineer company, 200 men, and valuable heavy machinery to blast a massive underground bunker complex into the side of a mountain for his personal safety. Eisenhower stood before this troglodyte headquarters, staring at the reinforced tunnels, the heavy blast doors, the air of permanence in a war of movement. It was an obscenity. Every hour spent digging these tunnels was an hour not spent digging anti-tank ditches or preparing firing positions at the front. It was the architecture of cowardice. Inside, the atmosphere was toxic. Fredendall, pale and exhausted, spoke in a strange, detached slang, referring to the Germans as naughty folks and using code words that confused his own staff more than the enemy. He blamed the British for not supporting him. He blamed the Air Force for not covering him. And he blamed his own troops for running. He blamed everyone but the man in the mirror. Eisenhower listened, his face a mask of stone, but his mind was already making the calculations of a ruthless CEO restructuring a failing corporation. He realized that Fredendall was not just incompetent. He was infectious. His fear had trickled down the chain of command, paralyzing the colonels, then the captains, until the private in the foxhole felt the tremor of indecision from the top. Fredendall commanded by map, rarely visiting his forward units, terrified of assassination, issuing orders that were meticulously typed but tactically nonsensical. He had tried to micromanage the battle from 80 miles away, moving individual companies like pawns on a board he couldn't see, while Rommel played the game in real time. Eisenhower knew that to leave Fredendall in command was to sentence thousands more Americans to death. The decision he made in that ravine was the moment the United States Army began to grow up. It was a decision to prioritize the mission over the man, to discard the peacetime pleasantries of the old Army Club and embrace the brutal meritocracy of total war. On March 6th, the axe fell. Eisenhower relieved Fredendall of command. It was done quietly, officially cited as a medical transfer to spare the general public humiliation, but every officer in North Africa knew the truth. Fredendall had been fired for failure. He was sent back to the United States to train troops, far away from the sharp end of the war. But the purge did not stop with one man. Eisenhower turned his gaze to the entire officer corps of the Second Corps. He ordered a comprehensive review of combat performance. Colonels who had frozen under fire were relieved. Majors who couldn't read a map or keep their men fed were sent home. It was a clearing of the deadwood, a painful but necessary surgery to cut out the gangrene before it killed the patient. Eisenhower knew that a fish rots from the head, and he was determined to sever the head. He sat down to write a report to General George Marshall in Washington, his pen scratching across the paper with the weight of history. He detailed the lack of discipline, the softness of the training, the dangerous tendency of American officers to pass the buck. He wrote that the American soldier was not yet a soldier. He was a civilian in uniform who had not yet accepted the terrible reality that his job was to kill and to die. The training in the States had been too easy, too structured, too safe. It hadn't simulated the chaos, the noise, the sheer terror of the German 88s. Eisenhower demanded a revolution in training doctrine. No more sleep, no more regular meals during exercises. Live ammunition to be used in training to harden the men to the sound of gunfire. He wanted the troops to hate their training so much that combat would seem like a relief. But firing the incompetents was only half the equation. The void left by Fredendall had to be filled. Eisenhower needed a replacement who was the polar opposite of the tunneling bureaucrat he had just dismissed. He didn't need a manager. He needed a gladiator. He needed a man who could walk into a room and suck the oxygen out of it, a commander whose very presence would terrify his own subordinates more than the Germans did. He needed someone who understood the theater of war, the power of the spectacle, someone who could take these beaten, slouching boys and shock them into becoming men. He needed a commander who believed in the offensive not as a tactic, but as a religion. Eisenhower reviewed the list of available generals. One name stood out. A man who was currently languishing in Morocco, preparing plans for the invasion of Sicily, chafing at the inactivity. A man who wore ivory-handled revolvers, who read the poetry of the ancient Greeks, and who believed in reincarnation, believed he had fought with Caesar and Napoleon. He was profane, arrogant, brilliant, and completely unstable by the standards of polite society. In peacetime, he was a liability. In war, he was a necessity. Eisenhower knew that unleashing this man on the Second Corps was a gamble. He was a volatile chemical element that could explode in the wrong direction. But looking at the demoralized faces of the soldiers in Tebessa, Eisenhower knew he had no choice. The patient was dying. It was time for the shock treatment. He picked up the phone and ordered Major General George S. Patton, Jr. to report to Tunisia immediately. The purge had cleared the ground. The debris of the amateur era was being swept away. The tunnels of Speedy Valley would be abandoned, leaving the ghosts of Fredendall's fear behind. The American army was about to undergo a transformation so violent and total that it would be unrecognizable within 30 days. Eisenhower had diagnosed the disease: a lack of will, a lack of discipline, a lack of bloodlust. Now he was bringing in the cure. The era of the Green Army ended with the stroke of Eisenhower's pen. The era of blood and guts was about to begin. The soldiers shivering in the Tunisian rain didn't know it yet, but their lives were about to change. The easy days were gone. The disciplinarian was coming, and he was bringing hell with him. March 6, 1943. The dusty road leading to the Second Corps headquarters in Jebel Quif. The air, usually filled with the grinding of gears and the lethargic murmur of a defeated army, was suddenly split by the wail of a siren, a sound so piercing and alien in the desert silence that soldiers dropped their mess kits to stare. What they saw coming toward them was not a standard military convoy, but a rolling act of theater. A half-track led the way, bristling with machine guns, followed by a scout car with its radio antenna whipping the air, and then the centerpiece, a command car polished to a shine that defied the dust, bearing oversized red plates with 2 massive silver stars. Standing in the back like a Roman proconsul returning from a conquest was Major General George S. Patton, Jr. He was 57 years old, but he radiated a kinetic energy that made men half his age instinctively straighten up. He wore a pair of ivory-handled revolvers strapped to his waist. Not regulation, never regulation, and his helmet was lacquered so heavily it gleamed like a mirror in the North African sun. His face was a mask of aristocratic disdain, his jaw set like a trap. The old man had arrived, and the temperature of the war changed instantly. Patton didn't waste a second on introductions or speeches about democracy. He walked into the headquarters, looked at the slovenly staff officers with their unbuttoned shirts and muddy boots, and declared war, not on the Germans, but on them. His first order was a shock to the system. a directive so petty and seemingly irrelevant to the business of killing Germans that the troops thought he had gone mad. He ordered that every soldier, from the front lines to the rear echelon, would wear their leggings, their helmets, and their neckties at all times. Neckties. In the desert. In the middle of a war. To the men who had just survived the slaughter of Kasserine, the order felt like a cruel joke, the whim of a disconnected martinet. They called it chicken shit, the universal soldier's term for pointless bureaucracy. But Patton wasn't interested in their comfort. He was interested in their souls. He understood something that the Fredendals of the world did not. An army that looks like a mob will fight like a mob. The enforcement was brutal. Patton roamed the rear areas like a vengeful god, his high-pitched voice cutting through the noise of the camps. He fined soldiers $25 for not wearing a helmet, half a month's pay for a private. For officers, the fine was $50. He didn't care if you were a mechanic working under a truck or a cook peeling potatoes. If you didn't have your helmet on and your tie straight, you paid. He famously fined the chaplain of the 1st Division for not wearing his leggings. When the chaplain protested that he was praying, Patton reportedly snapped, "When you pray to God, you wear your helmet, Colonel. You tell him I said so." The shock therapy was total. He banned the word foxhole, claiming it made men want to hide like animals. He ordered that all slit trenches be filled in. "We are going to hold the high ground," he bellowed. "We are going to attack. If you want to dig a hole, dig a grave for a German." The hatred for Patton in those first few days was visceral. The troops loathed him with a passion usually reserved for the enemy. They called him old blood and guts. Our blood. His guts. But beneath the grumbling, a strange alchemy was taking place. As the men were forced to shave every day, to shine their boots, to salute with a snap that cracked the air, they began to remember who they were. They stopped looking like refugees and started looking like soldiers. The slouch disappeared from their walk. The sullen silence in the mess halls was replaced by the griping of men who were united in their hatred of their commander, a shared adversity that bound them together tighter than any speech could. Patton was manufacturing pride through the back door of discipline. He knew that if he could make them fear him more than they feared Rommel, they would follow him into hell just to get away from his shouting. Simultaneously, Patton overhauled the logistics with the same ruthless efficiency. He found that the troops were eating cold sea rations while the officers ate hot meals. He fired the mess officers and ordered that every man, regardless of rank, would get a hot meal at least once a day. He realized that a soldier who thinks his commander doesn't care about his stomach won't care about his commander's orders. He raided the supply depots in the rear, cutting through the red tape that had strangled the flow of equipment. Suddenly, new rifles appeared. Spare parts for the tanks arrived overnight. The mail, which had been backed up for months, was delivered. The men realized that while Patton was a tyrant about neckties, he was also a provider. He demanded perfection, but he gave them the tools to achieve it. The transformation took exactly 27 days. In less than a month, the Toon Corps went from a broken, demoralized rabble to a tightly coiled spring. The change was visible in the way they held their weapons, in the way they looked at the British and French troops who had mocked them weeks earlier. They weren't just Americans anymore. They were Patton's men, and they carried themselves with a dangerous swagger. The Green Army had been drilled out of existence. Patton had instilled in them a doctrine of aggressive violence. He told them, "We are not holding anything. Let the Hun do that. We are advancing constantly, and we are not interested in holding on to anything except the enemy." Shan. On March 16th, just 10 days after taking command, Patton gathered the officers of the 1st Infantry Division. These were men who had seen their friends die at Kasserine, men who were cynical and tired. Patton stood before them. Not as a manager, but as a warrior priest. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered them a chance for revenge. "I want you to kill them," he told them, his voice rising. "I want you to rip their belly, buttons open, and use their guts to grease the treads of our tanks." It was violent, grotesque imagery, but it was exactly what they needed to hear. They needed permission to be savage. They needed to know that their commander wasn't afraid of the violence, but reveled in it. He told them they were the best soldiers in the world, and for the first time in months, they believed him. By the end of March, the test came. The II Corps was ordered to launch an offensive to draw German forces away from the British Eighth Army in the south. The target was Guettar. As the tanks of the 1st Armored Division revved their engines, the roar was different this time. It wasn't the tentative, nervous idle of Sidi Bou Zid. It was a throaty, confident growl. The infantry, their neckties tucked into their wool shirts, their leggings laced tight, climbed into their half-tracks with a grim determination. They were terrified, certainly. Only a fool isn't afraid of combat. But the panic was gone. The paralysis was gone. They were no longer thinking about how to retreat. They were thinking about how to kill. Patton watched the columns move out, standing in his jeep, his eyes hidden behind dust goggles. He had done the impossible. He had taken a beaten dog and turned it into a wolf. The systemic collapse of Kasserine had been reversed not by new technology or more reinforcements, but by the sheer force of one man's personality imposed upon 90,000 others. The Green Army was a memory. The army that rolled toward Guettar was a professional killing machine, forged in the indignity of fines and the polish of brass. The Germans monitoring the radio traffic noticed the change immediately. The hesitation was gone. The Americans were coming, and this time they weren't stopping. The 27-day revolution was complete. Now the Wehrmacht would have to deal with the result. The psychological reconstruction of the soldier was only half the equation. The other half was a fundamental rewriting of the physics of destruction. Under the blistering North African sun, while Patton was polishing the discipline of the men, a quieter but far more lethal revolution was taking place in the way the U.S. Army applied violence. The disaster at Kasserine had exposed a fatal flaw in American doctrine. The Army had been fighting as a collection of disjointed parts. The infantry walked alone, the tanks charged blindly, and the artillery fired at empty desert. They were playing individual notes in a cacophony, while the Germans were playing a symphony of combined arms. To defeat the Wehrmacht, the Americans had to learn to conduct an orchestra of fire, weaving infantry, armor, artillery, and air power into a single devastating tapestry. The most significant shift came from the king of battle, the artillery. Before Tunisia, American batteries often operated independently, firing at targets of opportunity with little coordination. It was annoying to the Germans, but rarely decisive. Now, the Americans introduced a concept that would terrify the Axis powers for the remainder of the war: the Centralized Fire Direction Center, FDC. Instead of individual battery commanders calculating their own firing solutions, forward observers radioed targets to a central brain, a tent filled with men using slide rules and graphical firing tables. These human computers could calculate the precise elevation and azimuth for dozens of batteries simultaneously. The result was a terrifying innovation known as time on target, or TOT. The mathematics of a TOT mission were diabolical in their elegance. The FDC calculated the flight time of shells from different batteries located at varying distances from the target. If Battery A was 10 miles away and Battery B was 5 miles away, Battery A would fire seconds earlier than Battery B. The goal was, for every single shell, hundreds of rounds of high explosive to impact the target at the exact same split second. For the German soldier on the receiving end, there was no warning whistle, no escalating drumbeat of explosions to seek cover. One moment there was silence. The next, the entire grid square simply disintegrated in a single instantaneous thunderclap of overpressure and shrapnel. It was a weapon of mass destruction delivered by stopwatch. This massed artillery capability meant that an American infantry lieutenant, pinned down by a machine gun nest, could pick up a radio and summon the wrath of an entire Corps artillery park, bringing down a rain of steel that could shatter a panzer attack before it even began. The Americans were learning that they didn't need to outmaneuver the Germans if they could simply delete the ground they stood on. Simultaneously, the Americans addressed their armor deficiency with a radical, albeit controversial, solution: the tank destroyer doctrine. Kasserine had proven that the Sherman tank, while reliable and easily produced, was not a hunter-killer capable of dueling the German Tigers and Panthers head-on. The solution was the creation of specialized tank destroyer battalions, agile units designed to ambush German armor rather than trade blows with it. The weapon of choice became the M10 Wolverine, built on a Sherman chassis but carrying a more potent 3-inch gun in an open-topped turret. The M10 was a glass cannon. It had thin, sloped armor that couldn't stop a heavy German shell, but it had speed and a gun that could finally punch through German steel at combat ranges. The crews were trained to think differently than tankers. They weren't there to support infantry or capture ground. They were there to hunt. They learned to use the terrain, to shoot and scoot, to flank the heavy German cats and put a round into their engine blocks before fading back into the wadis. It was a shift from the cavalier charge to the calculated ambush, a recognition that, in a technological mismatch, guile and velocity were the only equalizers. The final piece of this lethal puzzle was the integration of air power. During the early days of the campaign, the relationship between the ground troops and the Army Air Forces had been practically non-existent. Pilots flew high-altitude sorties that did little to affect the battle on the ground, leaving the GIs to be pounded by the Stukas. But as the command structure tightened, the air-ground team began to take shape. Forward air controllers, often pilots themselves riding in jeeps or tanks with the lead elements, began directing fighter bombers like the P-40 Warhawk and the P-38 Lightning onto specific tactical targets. The sky became an extension of the artillery. If a German strongpoint was out of range of the howitzers, a flight of P-40s could be called in to drop 500-pound bombs with pinpoint accuracy. The Germans, who had ruled the skies in 1940, now found themselves constantly looking up, their movements paralyzed by the swarm of Allied aircraft that patrolled the daylight hours. The psychological effect of this vertical envelopment was profound. It stripped the German panzer divisions of their greatest asset: mobility. They could no longer move in daylight without being spotted and strafed. The American Army was becoming a machine that operated in 3 dimensions. By mid-March 1943, the transformation was palpable. The hesitancy was gone. The American units moving into position for the next phase of the campaign were no longer loose collections of men and equipment. They were a tightly integrated system. An infantry squad leader knew that if he found a target, he had the radio link to call down hell. A tank commander knew that if he ran into something he couldn't kill, a tank destroyer or an airstrike was just a call away. They had traded the cowboy mentality for the methodology of an industrial slaughterhouse. They had stopped trying to be heroes and started trying to be technicians of war. The rigid textbook maneuvers of the peacetime army, which prescribed exact spacing and movement regardless of the terrain, were replaced by flexible, lethal coordination that adapted to the enemy. The Green Army had learned that the only fair fight is the one you lose, and they had no intention of fighting fair ever again. They were bringing the full weight of American industrial might to bear on a single point, creating a localized superiority that no amount of German tactical brilliance could withstand. The forge was hot, the metal was shaped, and the weapon was ready. All that remained was to test it against the master. March 20th, 1943, the supply depots of Tebessa, Algeria. If the front line was the tip of the spear, this was the muscle that drove it. In the wake of the Kasserine disaster, the II Corps had bled profusely, losing nearly 200 tanks, hundreds of trucks, and enough artillery to outfit a small nation. By the calculations of any European general staff, a unit that had suffered such catastrophic material attrition was combat ineffective, a broken formation requiring months of refitting before it could dare to face the enemy again. This was the assumption upon which Field Marshal Rommel had based his entire strategic gamble. He believed that by shattering the American armor, he had bought the Axis powers time, perhaps 3 or 4 months of respite while the Americans licked their wounds and waited for factories across the Atlantic to forge replacements. But Rommel was fighting a war based on the scarcity economics of the Old World, unaware that he was now locked in a death struggle with the first true superpower of the industrial age. He did not understand that the Americans treated tanks not as precious heirlooms to be nursed and repaired, but as disposable rounds of ammunition, mass-produced consumables to be used up and instantly replaced. While the smoke was still clearing from the Kasserine Pass, a logistical miracle was unfolding in the rear areas that would have broken the heart of any German quartermaster. The United States Army Services of Supply, SOS, a sprawling bureaucratic beast often mocked by the combat troops, shifted into a gear that no other nation could match. The order went out from Eisenhower's headquarters: replace everything. Immediately. There was no rationing, no prioritization, no debate. The arsenal of democracy simply opened its floodgates. At the ports of Oran and Algiers, the ocean turned black with the hulls of Liberty ships. These ungainly, welded steel cargo vessels were being launched from American shipyards faster than the U-boats could sink them, arriving in North Africa in a ceaseless conveyor belt of steel. They disgorged their bellies onto the docks. Hundreds of brand-new M4 Sherman tanks, smelling of fresh paint and Cosmoline grease. Thousands of 2 1/2-ton GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks. Crates of M1 Garand rifles, mountains of artillery shells, and oceans of gasoline. The scale of the influx was staggering. Within 2 weeks of the disaster at Kasserine, the U.S. II Corps had more tanks than it had started with before the battle. The 1st Armored Division, which had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force, was fully reconstituted with newer, better equipment before the Germans had even finished counting their own prisoners. The psychological impact of this logistical resurrection on the German command cannot be overstated. German intelligence officers monitoring the American radio traffic and observing the dust clouds of the supply columns were initially incredulous. They suspected a deception, operation, believing it impossible for an army to regenerate so much combat power in so little time. When reconnaissance photos confirmed the presence of hundreds of new tanks in the assembly areas, a cold realization began to set in. They were fighting a hydra. For every tank they destroyed, 2 more rolled off a ship to take its place. The German repair crews were performing miracles of engineering in the desert, cannibalizing wrecked vehicles to keep a handful of Tigers operational, welding patches over shell holes and reusing captured fuel. Meanwhile, the Americans were simply pushing damaged tanks into ditches and issuing fresh ones. It was a collision of 2 different centuries. The artisan warfare of the 19th century versus the industrial annihilation of the 20th. This logistics of recovery extended far beyond just heavy armor. It permeated the daily life of the soldier, fundamentally altering the morale equation. A German soldier in Tunisia was lucky to receive a letter from home once a month, ate moldy bread and canned sardines, and rationed his water like gold. The American soldier, backed by the terrifying efficiency of the Quartermaster Corps, lived in a different universe. The Red Ball-style convoys that snaked from the coast to the front lines brought a torrent of luxuries that the Wehrmacht could only dream of. Fresh socks, razor blades, mail from home delivered weekly, and the ubiquitous Coca-Cola, which General Eisenhower regarded as essential for morale. The Americans brought their civilization with them. This abundance had a profound tactical effect. An American tank crew that lost their vehicle could walk back to the depot, draw a new tank, load it with fuel and ammo, and be back in the fight within 24 hours. A German crew that lost a tank was often converted into infantry because there were simply no replacements. The connection between the factory floor in Detroit and the foxhole in Tunisia became the decisive factor of the campaign. The standard Sherman tank might have been technically inferior to a Tiger in a one-on-one duel, but the strategic reality was that the Tiger was a boutique exotic, while the Sherman was a commodity. The Willow Run plant and the Detroit arsenal were outproducing the entire Third Reich's output with a single shift. This allowed American commanders to engage in a brutal form of attrition warfare that the Germans could not sustain. Patton could afford to lose 5 tanks to kill 1 Tiger because he had 10 more waiting in reserve. It was a grim calculus, but it was a winning one. The American Green Army had learned that they didn't need to be better tacticians to win. They just needed to be relentless. They could afford to make mistakes, to absorb losses, to spend metal like water because the well was bottomless. Furthermore, the logistical system was adapting to the specific needs of the Desert War. The Americans quickly realized that the standard olive drab paint made their vehicles stand out against the sand, so vast quantities of desert tan paint were shipped and applied in the depots. They realized the sand was eating their engines, so improved air filters were rushed into production and flown to the front. This responsiveness, the ability to identify a problem, engineer a solution in the States, and deploy it to the battlefield in weeks, was a capability the rigid Nazi bureaucracy could not replicate. The Germans were fighting with what they had. The Americans were fighting with whatever they needed. By late March, the II Corps was a transformed entity. It was no longer the brittle, hollow force that had shattered at Kasserine. It was dense with material. The artillery parks were overflowing with shells. The motor pools were jammed with spare parts. The fuel dumps were so massive they could be seen from space. This material recovery gave the men a confidence that speeches never could. They looked around and saw the immense power of their nation made manifest in steel and rubber. They knew that if they fired their weapon, there were 1,000,000 more rounds where that came from. They knew that if their truck broke down, a new one would arrive. It removed the fear of scarcity that paralyzed the Axis forces. As Patton prepared to unleash this reconstituted beast at Guettar, the logistics served as the silent, crushing partner to his tactical aggression. The Germans were about to face an enemy that defied the traditional laws of warfare. They were about to learn that defeating the Americans in battle was meaningless if you could not destroy their supply lines. The Green Army had been beaten, yes, but the Industrial Army had arrived to take its place. And this army did not tire, it did not starve, and it did not stop. The road to victory was being paved not just with courage, but with an endless, overwhelming river of supplies that would drown the Africa Corps in a sea of American abundance. The war had shifted from a contest of skill to a contest of capacity, and in that arena, the United States had no equal. March 23, 1943, the Valley of Guettar, Tunisia. The sun rose over the jagged moonscape ridges of the Atlas Mountains, illuminating a scene that seemed, to the German commanders peering through their binoculars, like a repetition of history. Down in the valley floor, American positions appeared exposed, fragile, and ripe for the taking. The U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, was dug into the rocky slopes, seemingly pinned against the high ground with nowhere to run. To Major General Friedrich Freiherr von Broich, commander of the feared 10th Panzer Division, this looked like Kasserine all over again. He saw the same American equipment, the same shallow foxholes, the same apparent lack of depth. His division was the hammer that had shattered the Americans just a month prior. His crews were veterans who had painted white victory rings on their gun barrels after the slaughter at WWII. They knew the Americans as skittish amateurs who panicked at the first sign of a Tiger tank. As the engines of 50 German tanks roared to life, churning up the ubiquitous red dust, the mood in the German turrets was one of predatory anticipation. They were expecting a hunt, not a battle. They rolled forward in a classic wedge formation, the heavy panzers leading, the half-tracks filled with panzer grenadiers following close behind, confident that the Green Army would break and run the moment the first 88mm shell cracked overhead. But the valley was a lie. The Americans watching from the ridges were not the same men who had fled Kasserine. They had been stripped down and rebuilt by the profane fury of George S. Patton. They were clean-shaven, their helmets were strapped tight, and they had spent the last week digging not just foxholes, but complex, interlocking defensive networks blasting into the rock. More importantly, they were not alone. Hidden in the wadis and ravines, camouflaged under nets and scrub brush, was the new American doctrine lying in wait. The M10 tank destroyers, the wolves that Patton had unleashed, were positioned in hull-down defilade, their 3-inch guns silent, waiting for the command. Behind the ridges, the entire artillery park of the 2nd Corps was laid in, the firing data already calculated by the fire direction centers. This was not a defensive line, it was a kill box, and the 10th Panzer Division was driving straight into the center of the X. At 06 hours, the German assault began. The panzers accelerated, their tracks clattering over the hardpan, closing the distance. The American infantry held their fire. There was no panic, no premature shots that would give away their positions. The discipline that Patton had hammered into them held firm. The Germans pushed deeper into the valley, emboldened by the silence. They believed the Americans were paralyzed with fear. In reality, the Americans were waiting for the Germans to cross an invisible line on the map, a line that marked the convergence of every gun in the Corps. When the lead German tanks reached the 800-yard marker, the trap was sprung. It didn't begin with a single shot, but with the apocalypse. The order, Fire Mission Division, went out over the radio nets. In seconds, the sky above the valley was torn apart by the screech of hundreds of artillery shells. The time-on-target barrage arrived with mathematical perfection. The valley floor erupted. It wasn't just explosions, it was a geyser of earth, steel, and fire that consumed the German formation. The Panzer Grenadiers in their open-topped half-tracks were decimated instantly, the air filled with shrapnel that shredded men and machinery alike. The German tanks, buttoned up, found themselves driving through a man-made volcano. The shock was total. This was not the sporadic, confused shelling of Kasserine. This was a wall of fire that moved with the precision of a conductor's baton. As the dust and smoke obscured the German vision, the M10 tank destroyers struck. They didn't charge. They executed the ambush tactics they had been training for. Popping up from their hidden positions on the flanks, they poured high-velocity, armor-piercing rounds into the exposed sides of the German panzers. The Sherman tanks, often maligned for their thin armor, stayed back, using the terrain to peek and fire, acting as the anvil to the M10's hammer. The German tankers, disoriented by the artillery and blinded by the smoke, tried to rotate their turrets to find the enemy, but the fire was coming from everywhere. A Panzer IV would explode, its turret cartwheeling into the air, and before the crew of the tank next to it could react, they were hit. The hunters had become the prey. General Patton watched the slaughter from a forward observation post, his binoculars pressed to his eyes. He saw the burning hulks of the German tanks, 30 of them eventually littering the valley floor. He saw the German infantry, the vaunted veterans of the Eastern Front, pinned down and breaking under the relentless American fire. He turned to his aide, a savage grin on his face, and shouted the words that would define his legend. "They're murdering them! I'll be damned, they're murdering them!" It was a cry of vindication. The Green Army was standing its ground. The infantry, the men of the 1st Division, did not run. When the German tanks that survived the ambush tried to overrun the foxholes, the GIs stayed put, firing bazookas at point-blank range, throwing Molotov cocktails, fighting with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. They realized in the heat of that morning that the German tank was just a machine, and machines could be broken. The 10th Panzer Division, confused and battered, was forced to withdraw. It was the first time in the war that a full-strength German armored division had been stopped cold by American forces. The retreat was chaotic. The Germans left behind the burning wreckage of their armor, a graveyard of Teutonic ambition that smoked in the midday sun. But the true casualty was the myth of German invincibility. The Americans looked out over the valley and saw that the monsters were mortal. They saw that their own weapons, when used with intelligence and discipline, were lethal. The ghost of Kasserine had been exorcised in a ritual of fire. This victory was not just about holding ground, it was about the validation of a system. The artillery coordination had worked perfectly. The tank destroyer doctrine, while still imperfect, had proven that mobile firepower could blunt a blitzkrieg. The logistics system had ensured that every gun had enough shells to keep firing until the barrels glowed red. But most importantly, the American soldier had looked the Wehrmacht in the eye and hadn't blinked. The psychological turning point of the war in North Africa had occurred. The 10th Panzer Division had expected a mob. They met a buzzsaw. As the sun set on March 23rd, the valley of Guettar was quiet, save for the crackling of ammunition cooking off in the destroyed German tanks. The men of the II Corps sat in their foxholes, eating their sea rations, their faces caked with dust and gunpowder. They were exhausted, but they walked differently now. They were no longer the boys who had arrived in Africa thinking war was a game. They were veterans. They had taken the best shot of the German war machine and thrown it back in its face. Patton, writing in his diary that night, noted the change. "The men are confident," he wrote. "They know they can fight." The humiliation of February was washed away by the victory of March. The Green Army was dead. In its place stood a hardened, professional force that now looked toward the sea, and beyond it, to Sicily, Italy, and the heart of the Reich itself. The trap at Guettar had snapped shut, and the American army had finally arrived. May 13, 1943, the Cap Bon Peninsula, Tunisia. The end of the war in North Africa did not look like a battle. It looked like a migration. Over 230,000 Axis soldiers, the remnants of the once invincible Africa Corps and the Italian First Army, walked out of the hills to surrender. It was a haul of prisoners larger than the victory at Stalingrad. Field Marshal Rommel had long since fled to Europe, leaving his men to face the consequences of the Green Army's graduation. As the endless columns of German prisoners marched into captivity, past the silent, hulking shapes of American Sherman tanks and the dusty, confident GIs guarding them, a profound shift in the geopolitical balance of the world had occurred. Just 90 days earlier, these same Americans had been fleeing in terror through the Kasserine Pass, their equipment burning and their leadership paralyzed. Now they stood as conquerors. The transformation was so rapid, so total, that it baffled military observers of the time. How had a nation of shopkeepers and farmers with no martial tradition to speak of overtaken the masters of warfare in 3 months? The answer lay not in the thickness of their armor or the caliber of their guns, but in a uniquely American secret weapon: the institutional ability to fail, admit it, and rewrite the operating manual in real time. The United States Army had revealed itself to be a learning machine. Unlike the Wehrmacht, which was tactically brilliant but strategically rigid, bound by the ossified will of a dictator who refused to acknowledge bad news, the American military possessed a ruthless corporate pragmatism. It treated war not as a Wagnerian opera of destiny, but as an engineering problem to be solved. When the bridge collapsed at Kasserine, they didn't shoot the engineer. They fired the architect, redesigned the blueprints, and built a stronger bridge overnight. This culture of after-action reports became the nervous system of the victory. After every engagement, American officers were required to write brutal, honest autopsies of what went wrong. These weren't propaganda pieces to please a distant Führer. They were confessions of incompetence, detailed analyses of failure. Our sights are wrong. Our tactics are suicidal. The bazooka doesn't work against the tiger. This flood of negative data was not suppressed. It was devoured by the War Department. It traveled from the foxhole to the factory floor and back again with blinding speed. This adaptability was the antithesis of the Axis way of war. When a German tactic failed, the response from Berlin was often an order to stand fast or show more fanaticism. When an American tactic failed, the response was to change the tactic. The U.S. Army was Darwinian. It evolved under pressure. The doctrine of 1942 was discarded for the doctrine of 1943, which would be discarded again by 1944. The tank destroyer doctrine, which had its moment of glory at Guettar, would eventually be recognized as flawed and scrapped in favor of better tanks. The army that landed in Sicily a few months later was different from the one in Tunisia. The army that stormed the beaches of Normandy was different still. The soldiers were not just fighting the enemy. They were constantly debugging their own system. General Eisenhower was the embodiment of this managerial warfare. He was not a tactical genius in the mold of Napoleon or Rommel. He was a chairman of the board who knew how to leverage assets and fire underperforming executives. His decision to remove Fredendall and install Patton was the most visible example, but hundreds of similar decisions were made down the chain of command. A captain who couldn't hold his line was replaced by a lieutenant who could. A tank commander who hesitated was replaced by a sergeant who didn't. This meritocratic churn was brutal, but it ensured that by the time the Americans reached Europe, the officer corps was composed of survivors who had learned their trade in the school of hard knocks. They were no longer the socialites of the peacetime army. They were professional killers who understood the mathematics of attrition. The victory in North Africa also proved that the American industrial base was not just a supplier, but a partner in this evolution. The feedback loop between the front lines and Detroit meant that the weapons themselves evolved. When soldiers complained that the M3 Grant tank was a death trap, it was phased out. When they asked for better radios, better boots, better food, the might of American capitalism shifted to provide it. The Axis powers, struggling with resource shortages and bombed-out factories, could only watch in horror as the Americans not only replaced their losses but upgraded them. The Green Army had the luxury of making mistakes because it could afford the tuition. The Germans, fighting on a shoestring, had to be perfect every time. In a long war, perfection is impossible. Adaptability is inevitable. As the landing craft began to gather in the harbors of North Africa for the invasion of Sicily, the lesson of Tunisia was clear. The United States had entered the war as an amateur, stumbling and bloody. It had been punched in the mouth, humiliated, and nearly broken. But it had gotten back up, wiped the blood from its lip, and learned how to box. The Green Army was dead, buried in the sands of the Kasserine Pass. In its place stood a juggernaut, a force that combined the mass of a sledgehammer with the agility of a boxer. The road to Berlin was still long and bloody. There would be more defeats, more mistakes, more tragedies. But the fundamental question of the war had been answered. The Americans knew how to fight. They knew how to learn. And they knew that no matter how good the German war machine was, it was static, while they were dynamic. The sun set over the surrendered panzers in the Tunisian desert, casting long shadows over the wreckage of the Third Reich's African ambitions. The war had turned. The Americans were coming, and they were bringing with them a terrifying new way of war, one that didn't just overpower the enemy, but outthought, outproduced, and out-evolved them. The rude awakening was over. The Great Crusade had begun.